Montana Territory, July 1887. The sun was still dragging itself up over the wheatgrass when Kodiak Weller found the boy, barefoot and shivering beside an overturned wagon, the smoke from the busted axle fire curling into the pale sky like a ghost. The child could not have been older than 6. He had dust on his lips and the kind of silence that came from watching something too terrible to speak of. Kodiak crouched low, his rifle slung behind his back, and said gently, "Where's your folks, son?" The boy's lips parted, but no words came. He just lifted one trembling hand and pointed to the trees. Kodiak followed the path with his eyes. His stomach turned. 2 bodies lay still beneath the cottonwoods, a man and a woman. The wagon had been raided, likely 2, maybe 3 days ago. No horses, no supplies left. Just a boy and his sister who was now crawling from the wreckage, red-faced and coughing, 2 children. Abandoned by the world, Kodiak stood, heart aching in a way it had not since the war. He could walk away, leave them to someone else's kindness. But then the little girl looked up at him with her brother's same wide, hollow eyes, and he knew he would not be going anywhere without them. He gathered them both up, one on each arm. "Come on," he whispered. "You are with me now." They were halfway back to his homestead by dusk. Kodiak had not spoken much. He was not good with words, never had been. But he had given the boy who finally said his name was Porter a blanket over his shoulders and let the girl, Penny, sit the front of his saddle so she would not fall asleep and tumble off. They had not cried, not once. That scared him more than anything. The wind kicked up dry across the plains, tugging at the corners of his coat. His land stretched wide and quiet, nestled near the base of the crazy mountains. The cabin was small but warm, with a red tin roof and a porch swing he had built with his own hands. He had not expected to raise anyone here but himself. He never expected to see her again. Zadie Junehart was standing on his porch, same thick braid down her back, same steady eyes. Same way she folded her arms when she was trying not to cry. She looked older, sure. But she had always looked like the kind of woman time respected. She had a satchel slung over one shoulder and a rifle resting against the porch rail. She blinked at the children first, then at him. "Kodiak," she said. He stopped at the bottom step. "Zadie, I came to find work," she said. "Heard you had land enough to need help. I do." Silence stretched between them like a thread about to snap. "Who are they?" she asked softly, her gaze dropping to Porter and Penny. "Found them today," he said. "Wagon raid, no one left but them." She nodded once, slow and sure. Then she stepped forward and reached out her hand to Penny. "Come on, sweet girl," she said. "Let's get you cleaned up." Penny looked to Kodiak. He gave a small nod. The girl took Zadie's hand. Zadie led them inside without another word. Zadie had not been in his home for more than 10 minutes, and already she had water boiling and biscuits in the oven. Kodiak stood back, watching her move like she had never left. Like she still belonged here. She had not been his wife. They had not made it that far. But they had been everything else once. From the time they were children running barefoot through the same fields to the nights, he held her hand under the stars before he left for the war. She had kissed him goodbye on her father's porch in 1864, and he had come home in 1866 to find her gone. Wyoming Territory, she wrote, took a job teaching. Needed time, needed space. He never got more than 3 letters. Then nothing. Now she was here. Older, yes, but still the same woman he had loved with his whole broken heart. "I did not expect you," he said finally, after the children had fallen asleep on a bed of quilts beside the hearth. She looked up from the fire. "I did not expect to come back." "Why did you?" She hesitated, then shrugged. "I got tired of being alone," he nodded. "Me too." They sat quiet for a while. The fire cracked. The wind moved gently outside. Zadie cleared her throat. "You always wanted children." "I did. And now you have them." He nodded again. "For now." She looked over at him, her eyes softer than they had been earlier. "You are not going to give them up?" "No," she smiled faintly. "Good." By the end of the week, they had slipped into a rhythm. Zadie took over the kitchen and the garden. She taught Penny how to feed the chickens and helped Porter with his reading. Kodiak fixed the roof, mended the fence, and started carving new chairs for the table. Some nights they talked. Not always about the past. Sometimes about nothing at all. But each time she laughed at something he said, it felt like the world tilted just a little bit closer to right. One night, Porter had a nightmare, woke up screaming. Kodiak was there in an instant, arms around the boy, whispering steady things until the shaking stopped. Zadie stood in the doorway, her hand over her chest. Later, once Porter was asleep again, she found Kodiak outside, splitting wood. "You are good with him," she said. "I try." "That is more than most," he glanced at her, the moonlight caught in her hair. "I do not know what I am doing." "None of us do," she said. Then, after a pause, "You are not alone in it anymore." He looked down at his hands. "I do not want you to feel trapped here. I do not. You left once." "I had to. I thought I needed something else, but I was wrong." He met her eyes. "Zadie." She took a step closer. "I am not leaving again, Kodiak." He dropped the axe, took her face in his hands, and kissed her like it had been waiting 10 years to happen. She leaned into him, her hands curling in his shirt, and kissed him back with everything she had. When they finally pulled apart, her forehead resting against his, she whispered, "I never stopped loving you." He closed his eyes. "I never even tried." Inside, the children were still asleep, the fire was still warm, and outside, under the stars, two hearts that had once been broken found their way back to one another. The cattle fence gave out just after the noon meal 2 Sundays later. A storm the night before had softened the earth, and one of the corner posts had slipped free. Kodiak spotted it on his way in from checking the west pasture, mud thick on his boots, and the smell of rain still clinging to the air. Zadie stood just outside the barn with Penny and Porter, showing them how to braid a lead rope from old twine. She looked up when he called her name, shielding her eyes from the sun with the back of her wrist. "Fence gave," he said. "I'll need to set it right before the herd finds the break." "I'll come," she replied, already handing the twine to Porter. "You two stay near the barn, no wandering." Porter nodded with the kind of gravity that only came from recent loss. Penny just reached for the pale gray cat that had started lingering around the porch and nestled it in her arms like it was stitched from her own heart. Zadie fell into step beside Kodiak as they crossed the pasture. The grass reached her knees and the wind had a bite to it, even with summer still holding. He handed her the smaller post-hole digger without asking if she knew how to use it. She did. Her sleeves were rolled to the elbow, fingers already calloused from weeding the garden and hauling water from the creek in the mornings. They worked in silence until the sun began to lean westward. "I was meant to marry a man in Helena," she said after a while, her voice as even as the soil she packed around the new post. "He answered an advertisement I didn't place myself. My aunt wrote it, said I was wasting my years in Laramie. That I needed a husband before my spine set permanently straight." Kodiak tightened the wire with a steady pull. "You went." "I did. It was all arranged. He had a dry goods store 2 rooms above it. He sent a ticket and a photograph. I thought maybe it was time to let someone else decide my direction." He glanced at her, brows stitching faintly. "But he didn't marry you." Zadie shook her head. "Said I was too tall, that I'd make him feel small in his own home." Kodiak's jaw worked once, a silent clench, but he said nothing. "He wouldn't even let me speak for myself, just put me on the next southbound stage and told me to be grateful he hadn't made a fuss. I'd have broken his nose." She looked over, a slow smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. "I did that part myself." He laughed, low and quiet. "Good." They finished in another hour. The fence stood firm again, the wire pulled taut, and the new post sunk deep in bedrock. Kodiak wiped the sweat from his brow with the back of his wrist and looked out over the land, the sky wide and pale above them. "I didn't come to you because I was rejected," Zadie said after a pause. "I came because I remembered what it felt like to be known by someone who didn't need me to be less." He turned toward her, eyes steady. "You were never too much of anything for me." Her breath caught faintly, but she only nodded, then walked back toward the house, her boots brushing through the grass. Porter and Penny were still near the barn, gathering eggs from the henhouse. Penny held one in both hands like a prize marble, her smile small but real. Kodiak watched for a moment, then turned back to the fence to test the tension once more. The posts didn't lean now, neither did he. That night, after the children had gone to bed and the fire had dimmed to coals, Zadie brought out a tin of buttons and a length of yellow calico she'd salvaged from the bottom of her trunk. She sat on the floor by the hearth, sorting through the tin while Kodiak whittled not for need but for the quiet of it. "I want to make Penny a new dress," she said, holding up the fabric. "Something soft, she'd like that. I haven't sewn anything for someone else in a long time." He set down the knife and the half-shaped hickory handle. "You can stay, Zadie." She didn't look up. "I know, I mean it." Now she did look, fingers still over the open tin. "I know that too. I don't have much to offer." She slid the fabric aside, rose to her knees, and came to sit beside him. "You gave me more peace in 2 weeks than I've known in 10 years. He reached for her hand, calloused and warm in his, and threaded their fingers together. She didn't pull away. "I'd marry you tomorrow if you asked," he said, eyes never leaving hers. "I'd say yes tonight." His breath left him like a slow exhale after a long climb. "I'll need to go into town for a ring. I'll come with you." The next morning they hitched the wagon and drove the 7 miles to Big Timber. Penny sat between them, Porter at the back watching the road blur past. The town rose like a patchwork of boards and brick. The mercantile and the post office the only buildings with glass windows that didn't rattle in the wind. Kodiak stopped the wagon in front of the jeweler's. Zadie stayed with the children, watching as he stepped inside. He returned with a small box wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. He didn't hand it to her, not yet. Not until the day was right. They bought sugar, flour, and a new comb for Penny. Porter found a book on birds and clutched it to his chest like a sacred thing. They were halfway home before Zadie spoke again. "My mother was a seamstress," she said. "Died when I was 16. She used to say the best kind of love was the steady kind, the kind that didn't need to be chased." Kodiak nodded once. "We're not running anymore." Back at the homestead, he set the ring box high in the cupboard behind the jar of dried corn. It wasn't time yet, but it would be soon. That evening, he showed Porter how to oil the rifle stock properly, while Zadie taught Penny a hymn her mother had sung in German when baking. The girl didn't know the words but hummed the melody just the same. Flour smudged across her nose. The sky turned a dusky purple as night settled in. Zadie stood by the doorway, watching the last light fade across the hills. Kodiak joined her, hands tucked in his pockets. "I could build on," he said. "Add a room for the children," she nodded. "I think they'd like that. I'd like to do it before winter. We've time." He looked at her, the quiet between them not heavy but full. "Zadie?" "Yes. Will you wear the ring tomorrow?" She turned toward him, the fading light casting pink across her cheeks. "Yes," she said, and kissed him like a promise. Inside, the fire crackled low, and the children's breathing grew steady in the dark. Outside, the stars blinked into place one by one, like a prayer answered slowly but fully. The morning air carried a bite, the kind that hinted at early frost, though the cottonwoods still held most of their leaves. Kodiak rolled out of bed before the sun crested the ridge, careful not to wake the others. The cabin was still, save the soft rustle of Penny turning in her sleep and the distant yawn of an old timber beam stretching against the chill. He pulled on his boots, ran his fingers through the short mess of his hair, and stepped outside. The world was all pale silver and hush. He walked past the paddock, past the chicken coop, to the place where the land dipped near the creek. He stood for a long time, hands on his hips, watching mist rise in thin curls off the water. He hadn't dreamt it. The ring was tucked above the corn jar. Zadie had said yes, plain and steady, just the way he needed it. He'd meant to build a life alone, but now there were 4 of them, and it didn't feel like a burden. It felt like breathing. Behind him, the cabin door creaked. He turned to see Porter stepping out, wrapped in the old wool coat Kodiak had outgrown years ago. The boy's hair stuck up on one side, his eyes still puffy with sleep. "You're up early." Kodiak said. Porter rubbed his nose and nodded. You want to help me start the coop repairs after breakfast? Porter hesitated. Can I use the hammer this time? Kodiak gave a single nod. I think you're ready. They walked back together, the boy quiet but leaning just close enough for Kodiak to feel the weight of trust settling between them. Inside, Zadie was gathering flour from the sack by the stove. She wore her hair pinned up, a pale blue apron tied around her waist. Penny sat at the table, legs swinging under the bench, humming something Kodiak didn't recognize but knew Zadie must have taught her. Zadie didn't glance up when they entered. You've got dirt on your collar, she said, voice mild. Kodiak looked down. It's early for scolding. It's not scolding, it's noticing. She turned slightly and winked at Porter. You're both filthy. Porter gave a shy half smile, then padded to the table and reached for a biscuit from last night's batch. Kodiak moved to the stove and poured himself coffee. Zadie stirred the pot gently. I need to go into town today. He looked over her shoulder. What for? I want to speak with the parson, about the date. He wasn't sure why that caught him off guard, but it did. The ring was in her apron pocket now. She'd slipped it on that morning, no fuss, no ceremony, just a quiet kind of certainty. But hearing her mention the date made it all feel more real than before. You want me to come? No, she said. I want to do it alone. He nodded, trusting her reasons. I'll take Penny. She wants to see if that calico shop has any blue ribbon. Her tone was light, but her eyes held something more. You sure you don't want me there? I'll be back before dark. Their gazes held. He stepped forward, brushed a strand of hair from her cheek, and let his thumb rest there a second longer than needed. All right, then. By mid-morning, the wagon was ready. Zadie packed a small basket of bread and apples for the road and tied Penny's bonnet under her chin. Porter stood beside Kodiak, watching them go, his shoulders drawn up tight. You don't like her leaving? Kodiak asked. Porter shook his head. She'll be back. Porter looked up at him, uncertain. I've known her a long time, Kodiak added. She keeps her word. They spent the day repairing the coop, then mending a cracked board on the barn's lower wall. Porter worked hard, never complaining, though his arms tired halfway through and Kodiak took over the heavier nails. When they finished, they sat on the porch step, eating leftover biscuits with honey scraped from the bottom of the jar. The sun dipped low and still no wagon wheel creaked up the road. Porter leaned against him. Kodiak draped an arm over the boy's shoulders. She'll come, and she did. Just as the first stars appeared, the wagon turned up the trail, Penny waving a strip of blue from the seat beside her. Zadie drove steady, her face unreadable until she climbed down and walked straight to Kodiak. It's set, she said. 3 Sundays from now, he nodded once. Good. I told him we wanted it quiet, just the 4 of us and the parson. That's what I hoped. She didn't say anything else, just leaned into his shoulder. He reached for her hand, and they stood there like that for a long while, the world stretching out around them, wide and calm. That night, after the children were down and the fire was low, Zadie sat at the table with her sewing kit, working on Penny's dress. Kodiak sat across from her, carving another handle, this one smaller, shaped to fit the curve of a child's palm. You ever think about Wyoming? He asked. She didn't look up. Not anymore. You left something there, she paused, needle hovering. A grave, a friend from the school. She caught fever the same winter I was offered the post in Laramie. She said I should go, that I had hands made for more than chalk and ledgers. He waited. I stayed by her bed till the end, then I packed and left. I never went back. He watched the way her fingers moved, steady and sure. She'd be glad you came here, I think so. The wind stirred outside. Kodiak stood and crossed to the hearth, feeding another log into the coals. You ever miss the war? She asked. No, he said. But I remember it most when it's quiet. She didn't press. They didn't need to explain everything. In the morning, Zadie took Penny to the creek to wash the calico. Porter helped Kodiak in the field, tying bundles of cut grass for the winter bedding. The days passed slow and full, each one carrying them closer to the wedding. The Sunday before, they drove to Big Timber with both children dressed neat. Porter in a wool vest Zadie had taken in at the sides, Penny in the blue dress stitched with a single line of embroidery across the collar. They spoke with the parson again. He offered a hymn and a Bible blessing. Zadie declined the hymn. "I'd rather hear the wind," she said. The parson understood. On the drive home, Penny fell asleep against Zadie's arm and Kodiak reached across the wagon bench to cover their joined hands with his. When the day arrived, the sky was clear and dry. The sun crept over the hills like it had waited for them. Kodiak wore his cleanest shirt, the collar pressed flat. Zadie wore a cream-colored dress she'd sewn from muslin, plain but graceful, with a single mother-of-pearl button at the neck. They stood with the children between them. Porter held the Book of Vows. Penny clutched a small bouquet of sage and yarrow that Zadie had gathered that morning. The parson spoke soft and measured. Words came easy, not heavy. When he asked Zadie if she would take this man, she said yes without pause. When he asked Kodiak, he looked at her and said, "With all I am." The ring slid over her finger where it belonged. Penny beamed. Porter looked up at Kodiak like he'd found his place in the world. They shared a kiss, quiet and full, and the wind stirred through the grass behind them like a sigh. After they returned to the homestead, Zadie baked a pie with wild berries Porter had gathered the day before. They ate on the porch, the four of them, plates balanced on knees, laughter rising in soft bursts. That night, when the children were asleep and the fire burned low, Kodiak reached for her hand and didn't let go. "You're not too tall," he said. She looked at him, eyes shining in the firelight. "I know that now." He kissed her, not because it was owed, but because it was right. Their life stretched before them, not perfect, not easy, but theirs. And together they stepped into it. The first snow came earlier than anyone expected, blanketing the ridgeline by mid-September and dusting the pasture in a way that made the land look gentler than it was. Kodiak stood at the barn doors that morning, his breath hanging in the air, watching the flakes settle on the shoulders of the mule. The animal didn't seem to mind. Neither did Porter, who was tugging at a frozen latch with both mittened hands and a quiet determination that reminded Kodiak of the boy's mother, whoever she had been. Zadie came down the porch steps, shawl wrapped tight, cheeks pinked from the cold. She carried a basket with the last of the apples they'd picked, planning to stew them before the fruit softened too much to save. She hadn't said it, but he knew she was counting jars in her head, measuring what they'd have left come February. "There's a split in the south wall of the barn," he said, nodding toward the far end. She pulled her shawl tighter and followed his gaze. "You'll need fresh planks, likely 3. I'll take the wagon down to the mill tomorrow. They'll have cutoffs. Don't want you driving that road alone if the snow sticks. It won't, not yet. Besides, I'll take Porter. He wants to see the saw blades." Kodiak didn't answer right away. He didn't like the idea of her driving that slope alone, but he also knew she'd navigate it better than most men he'd known. She saw things others didn't: weak bends in the road, the way the wind pulled smoke east in the mornings, how the mule favored its left leg on inclines. "Take the rifle," he said finally. "The gray one. It's truer than the rest." She nodded, and he watched her walk back toward the house, her boots leaving even prints in the growing snow. Inside, Penny was bent over a piece of muslin, her tongue caught between her teeth in concentration. She was stitching a doll's dress, the needle oversized in her small fingers. Zadie paused by the hearth, adjusted the kettle, then knelt beside the girl. "You'll want a backstitch here," she said, pointing gently. "I like the way it looks this way." Zadie didn't correct her. "Then keep it." Porter came in trailing snow and excitement. "Can I ride in the wagon tomorrow?" Zadie gave him a quick glance. "You'll need to be up before the sun." "I will be." Kodiak watched them from the doorway, a quiet warmth settling in his chest like coals banked for the night. The next morning, Zadie and Porter left before first light. Kodiak stood in the cabin doorway long after the wagon wheels had faded into the hush, not because he doubted her, but because he never liked watching someone he loved vanish toward a bend in the road. He spent the day hauling hay to the loft and mending the broken hinge on the smokehouse door. Penny helped where she could, fetching nails, holding the lantern steady when clouds rolled in early and the light dimmed too soon. By dusk, he had the fire stoked and supper half prepared when the wagon returned. Zadie stepped down first, arms full of bundled planks, cheeks raw from the wind. Porter hopped down behind her, his cap askew, and held up a small wooden disc. "They let me keep this. It's from the edge of the saw." Kodiak took it, turning it over in his hand. The grain was tight, the cut clean. "Good piece of pine." Zadie shook snow from her shawl. "Weather's turning fast. The miller says it might hold a few more weeks, but not to count on it." He nodded. "I'll get the barn patched tomorrow." She brushed past him, her hand grazing his waist as she moved to the stove. He caught her fingers in his for a breath, then let her go. 3 days later, the wind shifted. It came down hard from the north, rattling the windows and sending the chickens into a flurry. Zadie pressed old flour sacks into the cracks around the sills and lined the door with a roll of wool she'd salvaged from an abandoned homestead last spring. Kodiak worked beside her in silence, his fingers raw from hauling water before the well froze. That night, she sat at the table with a ledger, making columns in careful script. He watched her for a while before asking, "You worried?" She shook her head. "Not yet." He nodded, and the two of them sat there, the fire spitting in the hearth, the children asleep in the loft. "I got a letter," she said after a while. "From the woman who runs the school in town." He waited. "They're short a teacher, just until spring." She asked if I'd come. "You thinking about it?" I told her no. His breath eased out slow. "Why?" Zadie set down her pencil. "Because I don't want to be anywhere else. I'm tired of borrowed rooms and borrowed lives. I want ours." He reached across the table and laid his hand over hers. "You have it." She looked up and something passed between them, then quiet, sure, like a door closing gently behind them and a new one opening just ahead. The snow deepened by the week's end. Kodiak spent more time in the barn than the house, stretching feed, checking traps, ensuring the roof held. Zadie kept the hearth warm and the larder organized. She showed Penny how to boil down bones for broth and taught Porter long division with stones laid out in rows. One night, as they sat together after supper, Zadie reached into her sewing basket and pulled out a square of fabric she hadn't touched since early fall. "I want to start a quilt," she said. "A proper one, for our bed." Kodiak raised an eyebrow. "We've got blankets. We've got pieces of things. I want something made whole." He didn't argue. Instead, he leaned back in his chair and watched her cut the first square. By late October, the creek froze clean through. The mule grew restless in the barn, stamping at nothing. Kodiak knew the signs. They'd be locked in soon, snow past the threshold, days lit only by fire and the small gold of window light. One morning, Zadie pulled him aside after the children had gone to the loft. "I want to ask you something," she said. "All right. If something happens to me," she held up a hand before he could speak. "If not when, I want you to keep them, not send them off to some cousin or schoolmaster." He stared at her, throat tight. "Nothing's going to happen, but if it does, I need to know you'll keep them as your own." "I already do." She looked away then, blinking fast. "I know." He reached for her, pulled her close. She didn't cry. She just leaned against him with the kind of weight that said she hadn't let herself be held in this way in a long, long time. That winter didn't break records, but it tested them. Drifts reached the lower window panes. The stovepipe froze once, and Kodiak had to climb to the roof in the dark to knock it clear with a length of iron. Zadie kept the children's hands busy quilt squares, reading lessons, stories told in whispers when the wind howled too loud for sleep. One night, in the dead hush between wind gusts, Kodiak woke to find her sitting by the fire, legs wrapped in a blanket, sewing in her lap. "You all right?" he asked, voice rough. "I couldn't sleep." He rose, crossed to her, and sat on the floor beside her chair. She didn't look at him, just kept stitching. "I've never been loved this way before," she said quietly. He rested his hand against her ankle, the only part of her not covered in cloth. "You make it easy," he said. She gave a faint laugh. "That's not true." "No," he agreed, "but it doesn't matter." She set the quilt aside and reached for him. By March, the thaw had begun, slow and stubborn. The land didn't give up the cold easily. But the creak whispered again, and the mule stopped pacing. Zadie stood on the porch one morning, shawl hanging open, hand resting on the beam Kodiak had carved their initials into when he was 17 and still too shy to speak his feelings out loud. She turned when he stepped out beside her. "Spring's coming," she said. He slid his arm around her waist. "It is," she leaned into him. "I want to plant beans this year. You'll have them. And I want to teach Penny to ride proper." He nodded. "We'll start with the mule." She laughed, and the sound of it carried across the yard, warm and whole. He turned to her then, fully, both hands at her waist. "You ever think about how far we've come?" She looked up at him, eyes steady. "I think about how far we still get to go." He kissed her slow, the wind soft for once, the sky wide and open ahead of them. The first warm wind came in early April, rattling loose shingles on the cabin roof and stirring the brittle stalks left from last year's corn. Kodiak stood barefoot in the doorway, the wood cool beneath his heels, watching the meltwater run in thin rivulets down toward the creek. The air smelled of thawing earth and wet bark. Behind him, Zadie moved lightly through the kitchen, apron dusted with flour as she rolled dough into neat rounds for the pan. Porter was out back, oiling the harness straps and laying them in the sun to soften. Penny sat cross-legged on the porch, humming under her breath as she peeled small carrots Zadie had overwintered in sand. The girl worked slow, careful not to cut too deep, her hands already knowing more than most grown women Kodiak had met in town. He stepped out into the yard and bent to check the wagon wheel spokes. The freeze had strained the wood, and two needed tightening. He fetched the iron wrench from the shed and crouched low, working each bolt until the wheel sat firm again. When he returned to the porch, Penny looked up and held out a sliver of carrot. "For you," she said. He accepted it, chewing slowly. "Tastes like spring." She nodded solemnly and went back to peeling. Inside, Zadie wiped her hands on her apron and turned to face him as he entered. "I've been thinking about the north field." He pulled off his boots. "What about it? It's wasted space as it is. If we cleared the brush and ran a fence line, we could keep a few goats." He leaned against the door frame. "Goats, they'll eat what the cows won't. And Penny could learn to milk them. She barely reaches the lower rail of the gate. She'll grow." He crossed the room and rested his hand on her waist. "You already have plans drawn, don't you?" She gave a small shrug. "Rough ones?" "I'll check the fence posts tomorrow." She reached up and smoothed the edge of his collar. "We'll need to barter for the animals. I can sew 2 more quilts by month's end." He kissed her temple, slow and deliberate. "You don't always have to give something away just to get what you need." "I know." Then quieter, "But I prefer to." That evening, after the children had gone to bed, Kodiak pulled the ledger from the shelf and sat beside her at the table. They worked by lamplight, listing what they could trade, what they could spare, and what they'd need to build before the goats arrived. Zadie's handwriting was precise, her calculations neat. He added his notes in the margin, sketching a rough plan for the new shelter. When the oil in the lamp ran low, she leaned back in her chair and studied him. "Do you ever think about leaving?" He didn't look up. "Leaving what?" "Here, all of it, starting somewhere else." "No." She folded her hands in her lap. "I used to before." He met her gaze. "And now? I don't want to move again. I want the children to look back and know where their home was." He closed the ledger and placed it on the shelf. "Then we'll make sure they do." By the following week, the snow had melted down to damp earth, and the first green shoots began to creep up along the fence line. Zadie traded 1 quilt and 6 jars of apple butter for a pair of goats from a rancher 2 valleys over. Kodiak and Porter rode out with the wagon, returning near dusk with the animals tethered and docile, their coats patched but healthy. Penny named them Hazel and Larkspur. She sat cross-legged in the straw, whispering to them as if they were secrets she couldn't share with people. Zadie watched from the doorway of the barn, her arms crossed lightly, a soft smile hidden in the corners of her mouth. That night, as they lay stretched beneath the quilt she'd started in winter, Kodiak turned to her. "You ever miss teaching?" She was quiet a moment. "Sometimes." When Porter reads out loud and I see the shape of the words catch in his mind, but I like this more. He traced a slow line along her collarbone. "This," she turned to face him fully. "You them this quiet life," he kissed her shoulder. "I never thought I'd have it. You do now." They fell asleep with the windows open, the sound of frogs rising from the creek like a lullaby. Summer passed without hardship, the land giving more than it took. The goats settled in, and Penny grew bold enough to lead them by rope to the creek and back. Porter kept the barn swept and the tools oiled, his shoulders filling out with the kind of work that made a boy into something steadier. Zadie tended the garden and kept the house, but she also found time to walk the ridge trails again, her boots worn smooth at the heels. She brought back wild herbs and stories, some of them true, some of them only half so. In August, they built a new shelf along the west wall of the cabin, and Kodiak carved each of their names into the edge: Zadie, Porter, Penny, and himself. No titles, just the names side by side. One morning, Zadie found a letter tucked under the saddle blanket, a reply from her sister in Missouri, the first in over 5 years. She read it twice, then folded it and placed it in the drawer beneath the breadboard. Later that evening, Kodiak found her on the porch, shelling peas into a tin bowl. "What did she say?" "She's glad I'm well. She heard I'd married." He sat beside her. "She coming out." "She won't. Her health's poor." He didn't press. They sat together until the bowl was full. In early September, Kodiak and Porter rode into town for salt and nails. When they returned, they brought back a dry goods clerk who'd lost her lodging and needed a place to stay for a few nights. Zadie set up a cot in the barn and made her tea with mint from the garden. The woman left with a bundle of cloth and a promise to write, and Penny stood at the gate long after the wagon disappeared down the road. "She didn't have anyone," Penny said. "No," Zadie replied, smoothing the girl's hair, "but she will." The first frost didn't come until late October. By then, the barn was full, the root cellar stacked high, and the quilt on their bed had grown soft with use. That night, Zadie lay curled beside Kodiak, her breath warm against his chest. "I want to take the children to the river next spring," she said. "Let them see the salmon run. We'll do it. And I want to teach Penny to read music. She hums in keys without knowing. You'll make a piano out of fence boards next." "I'd try," he laughed quietly, the sound full and easy. "You've given them more than anyone ever gave you." She pressed her palm flat against his chest. "You gave me the space to do it." As the wind rose outside, pressing against the cabin with soft insistence, they held each other close, not out of fear, but from the simple need to stay near. When spring came again, the ridge bloomed with wild lupine, and the creek ran fast and clear. Porter built a birdhouse from scrap wood, and Penny played a tune on a cedar flute a traveling minister had given her in trade for bread and dried apples. Zadie stood in the garden one morning, the sun on her face, hair loose and wind stirred. Kodiak came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist. "Looks like it'll be a good season," he said. "It already is." They kissed there among the rows of new shoots and the scent of turned earth. The children laughed somewhere near the barn, and the wind carried their voices high. They did not need more than they had each other, and the land and the slow, certain rhythm of days well lived, and that was enough.